comes in the name of the Lord. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever.
Wisdom.
The reading is from Paul's letter to the Philippians.
Let us be attentive.
Brethren, rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say, rejoice. Let all men know your forbearance. The Lord is at hand. Have no anxiety about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, do. And the God of peace will be with you.
Peace be unto you, the reader.
Alleluia. Alleluia. Alleluia.
Wisdom arise, let us hear the holy gospel. Peace be unto all.
And with your spirit.
The reading is from the Holy Gospel according to St. John. Let us be attentive.
Glory to you, O Lord. Glory to you.
6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus, who had been dead, and whom Jesus had raised from the dead, lived. Therefore they gave a supper for him there. Martha served, while Lazarus was one of those who sat at table with him. Mary took a pound of fragrance of pure nard, very precious. She anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment. Then Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, one of the disciples, and the one who would betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Now Judas said this not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and having the money box, he used to steal what was put in it. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." Meanwhile, a large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there. They came not only for Jesus' sake, but also in order to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. The chief priests even conspired to put Lazarus to death as well, because on his account many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. On the next day, a great multitude had come to the feast, and when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, they took branches from palm trees, and they went out to meet him, crying, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." Having found a donkey, Jesus sat on it. As it is written, "Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." His disciples did not understand these things at first, but after Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written about him, and that they had done these things to him. Now the multitude that had been with Jesus when he had called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify about it. For this reason also the crowd had come out to meet him, because they had heard that he had done this sign.
Glory to you, O Lord. Glory to you.
Christ is in our midst.
He is and always shall be.
Everything that we celebrate of Christ and in the church and today goes all the way back to a little disparate people, Hebrews, that the living God chose as his own and revealed the Son of God through it. So everything that we are and have as and know as Christians comes from Judaism. They started out as nothing, and then basically a small group of people, nomads, imprisoned in Egypt, with fortunes going up and down economically and politically, and then being led out 40 years in the desert, and finally arriving in their own country and establishing a kingdom. The feasts of Israel, the major ones, Pentecost, and then the Passover, and the Feast of Booths or Tents. These celebrate those moments. So Passover is the freedom from Egypt and being saved from death when Pharaoh's children were killed, the Egyptians' children were killed. And then the Feast of Booths or Tents is the memory of 40 years in the desert, living in tents with no home. And then Pentecost is the giving of the law. We've inherited these with changes because of the revelation of Christ. And today, when we celebrate Palm Sunday, it's important to have this in a historical context and also to have a sense of the larger political system that was there to help us understand what was going on. Keep in mind that as Israel became a nation, it first built a tent for God, and then David built and Solomon built a huge temple, which was destroyed by the Babylonians in 520 something. And then 60 years later, a second temple was rebuilt. That's the temple that was there when Jesus and the disciples were here, and it had been expanded starting in about 20 BC by Herod, who worked on it, his people, for 80 years. So it had just been finished when the Romans destroyed everything in 70 AD. Those movements into creating the temple are physical monuments and physical ways of expressing an eternal, invisible reality, that the holiness of God, surrounded by the angels, surrounded by the creation, is like a kind of ascent. And so you've heard the Psalms of Ascent. Well, those psalms were said as they ascended in the steps within the temple complex. It's built at about 2,500 feet, the highest point in Jerusalem. And it took up 1/4 of the entire city of Jerusalem. So it's enormous. It was the largest temple complex in the world in its time. Sometimes we don't realize how extraordinary this was. The stones that were used in it, the average stone was about 35 tons. They had 10,000 wagons transporting these. It's really, I think, some kind of mystery how they were able to do this. One of the stones, the largest one, is 570 tons. Can you imagine trying to do this? So the temple has enclosures. It has, the outer one is the temple of the Gentiles, the non-Jews. Everyone can go there. This is the Temple Mount, and everyone has access. But as you go toward what would be in the center of it, the Holy of Holies, in which the high priest alone can go into one time a year, there are gradations. So after you get through the Gentiles, then there is the court of the women. This is where the money was put into the treasury, and at this point you will come up to a lattice work. David had lattice before the ark. Solomon did it in his temple, and it was done in this one, similar to what we have with an iconostasis. The lattice was a kind of like a spiritual ritual gate, like a metal detector. Only what it detected was, were you in a pure state? Were you Jewish? So you could come through. And there were signs on it that said, if you come through here and don't belong here, it is on the penalty of death. This was the only thing that the Romans allowed the Jews to do, execute people on their own. They couldn't do it for any other broken law, but they could do it for someone who was not supposed to be at the place in the temple where they were allowed to be. So you go from the Gentiles to the women to, then there were a bunch of rooms. You had the Sanhedrin that met in one. You had the Levites that were tending the kindling, that kept the fires going. They served as the police. And the Levites and the priests were not chosen by, if you were worthy or not. It was a bloodline. So all the priests in Israel came from the Aaronic line, from Aaron. All the Levites came from Levi. A Levite could never become a priest. And a priest his quality was only because he was born that way. However, because no one could go into the area where the priests were, the priests had to learn metalworking, stonework, carpentry, and all the other things necessary to keep the temple in good repair, and it was always being added on to. So gold was being brought to the temple. Metal workers were making grape leaves and grapes, elaborating it. The entire temple, which in the middle, the place where has the Holy of Holies and its outer court, this was 17 stories high. It was as wide and as high both ways, and it was covered entirely in gold, about the thickness of a coin. Everything was bright white marble with gold. Some of the doors were 60 feet high, and it took 200 Levites to close and open the doors on a daily basis. There were 10,000 priests, 10,000 Levites, and they would serve for 2 weeks, 3 times a year. Every male had to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year for those 3 major feasts: Pentecost, Booths, Passover. Hundreds of thousands of people would be there. So the place would swell because you had Jews all over the world, and they would come for this. So this is something to give us a background. There was nothing like this anywhere. This was an extraordinary thing that could be seen from miles away, and it couldn't even be looked at with your eyes when the sun shone on the gold because it was so bright. So it's an extraordinary thing. No wonder the disciples, when they go there, say, "Lord, look at these stones, what buildings?" And Jesus says, "Not one of these stones will be left on another." Something is happening here now where, and interestingly, Eva Constantinou, it's a wonderful book she writes on this history of the King of Glory, if you're interested in more of this. But the Romans took 3 years to conquer the city in 70 AD. They finally got in there, and when they did, they destroyed the temple, and it was on the exact same date as the temple that was destroyed by Babylon. Very interesting little detail. These things aren't insignificant. So here we have the prophecy of Zechariah on what we call Palm Sunday being fulfilled by the Messiah. This is the first time Jesus has been publicly proclaimed as the King of Israel. You've had little suspicions and things going on during the teaching, as we see in the Gospels. But this is the first time publicly. So you have children, people throwing their coats down, palm leaves, and this extraordinary effervescence over the fact that a man dead 4 days is alive, and Jesus is spending his time at that home. He goes to Bethany because Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are his friends, and he stays there. This last week, he'd go to Jerusalem, go back to Bethany. By the way, I think I mentioned to you in Cyprus, where Lazarus went, they found his tomb, and on it was written, "Friend of Jesus, 4 days dead." Isn't that something? So they have his skull and part of his relics that are there now, still there. So, why did they want him dead? Well, the first century Jewish texts and some of the Talmud speaks about how corrupt the chief priests were. Now, you had 10,000 priests, then you had chief priests. The chief priests were chosen from the wealthiest of the clergy families, and the high priest from there. So as you got into that, you got into the sympathizers and those that were working with Rome to make sure that they kept as much freedom in their enslavement to Rome as possible. As long as the taxes were paid, Rome was happy. Now, if you didn't pay your taxes, you were in big trouble. Rome sent their legions and they wiped out the town of Sepphoris. They crucified the people in it and sent some of them to the mines and destroyed the whole city because they didn't pay taxes. So the chief priests and the Sanhedrin were in a bit of a predicament because they had the power and they had the affluence. And they knew what Rome would do. Rome had a fortress, Antonina Fortress, that sat with a garrison right over the top of the temple. So they could see down in there. If something went wrong and there was a melee, or there was any threat to the governance of Rome that might get them to intervene, the Sanhedrin would have lost power and it would have been a terrible thing. So they see themselves, in one sense, as trying to preserve that history that began back in the beginning. But they're also so corrupt, some of them, that the Talmud says that they would send men with clubs to steal the leather from the ordinary priests who lived out in the country, and they only served 3 times a year for 2 weeks. They had to make a living outside of just getting what was brought to the temple. So they weren't wealthy. The chief priests would send people out there like mafia with clubs and take what they had. Some of the priests starved to death. So we know historically that this was a very corrupt situation. So this wasn't just wonderful people that, didn't understand who Jesus was. They were very threatened by him because if he is being hailed as king, he's a threat to them and to Rome. So they were going to put him to death and were looking for an excuse to do that long before Judas ever betrayed him. They tried to stone him to death on one occasion. Remember when he spoke at Nazareth? They tried to throw him over a cliff. His life was in danger repeatedly. But now, he came that week knowing that this would be the end. So when he rides in on the donkey, he doesn't ride in on a horse. Who rides in on a horse? A conquering general. He didn't come to overthrow Rome. He didn't come as a revolutionary. He didn't come as a political person. He came as the Son of God. And the city didn't know how to receive the Son of God. Some did, but those in power couldn't do it. If you speak against the war in Ukraine and Russia, you'll be taken by the police and go to jail. Governments always have their view of what needs to be. And it's just a question of how far the government will go to suppress or even kill people who don't go along with what it is they say. Jesus he was not an activist in that direct sense, but he was an activist in a much more powerful sense, because if we were to follow God and not politics and not economics and not greed, we would find our way. It may lead to martyrdom, we don't know. He does predict, if you follow me, they will hate you as they did me. Who will hate me? Not the people looking for Christ, the people that will hate that which Christ is and those who follow him are those who are possessed by greed, power, influence among others, and place that above truth and love. This is idolatry. This is the passions that set fire in us. I was talking with Tom at the food bank puzzling over Judas, wondering why would one of his disciples betray him. But then I read some things about the fact that there's clues all through the Gospels that the disciples even say. He stole money. We saw what we heard the reading today. He couldn't see what was happening between Mary and Christ. All he saw was, could have sold this and made some money off of it. His blindness in one sense. Why would Jesus put someone like that in charge of the treasury? Why would he give him a piece of food when John asked, who's going to betray him? He says, the one I give this morsel to. And he gives it to Judas. He looks him in the face. And Judas gets up and Jesus then says, go and do what you're doing and do it quickly. Professor Constantinus says, even to that last moment, Christ loved his enemy. And that Judas didn't have to do that. He could have looked into Christ's eyes and wept. He could have said, my God, forgive me for what I was about to do. But he didn't. All of us have a chance to the last breath of our life to turn around and to put who is true first above everything else and orient our life around us. But no one will make us. And if we don't, we will destroy the temple of our heart and injure others. St. Nilus, the solitary in 400s, along with many of the fathers, but he's a good one, who raises up the donkey. He says the donkey represents not just that donkey, but purity. Only purity that accepted the holiness of the Savior could go through the gates of Jerusalem. And where did he go? He went into the gates of Jerusalem, but the only one who had the holiness, the goodness, the purity to be in the Holy of Holies, who is himself the Holy of Holies, was not allowed. So when he's crucified, the cloth, which is as thick as a man's hand, that takes 300 priests to hold it, to lower it into the water, to purify it, ripped in half. This was the curtain that was in front of the Holy of Holies. And so what Christ says to them is, destroy this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. That's at his trial. They're infuriated. It's taken 40 years to build this temple because he speaks of that which is invisible to us, which we ourselves fail too much in our own life to see. He is the temple. We are his body. And by his body and blood, we enter into him, into the Holy of Holies, by his grace. But we don't have to. And just like the temple in Jerusalem, if we presumptuously, carelessly, arrogantly, naively walk the aisle and think that we're worthy to receive his body and blood, this is a grave mistake. St. Paul says some get sick and die from that. We don't want to come with a hard heart. We want to come as the publican. My dear God, I don't deserve to receive you into me. But because of trust in your love and mercy, I come with my head on the ground before you. Let us do this as we proclaim him, the Son of God. Again and again in peace, let us pray to the Lord.